Okay, we're 200 pages in and still aren't out of the character creation section. Oh man, if I don't make it, this is where I died, folks. This book is chunky. Hey, BoLS fans, what's up? JR here today with Pathfinder 2nd Edition's core rulebook. That's right, this is the new edition of the game. It is a beefy book, as you can see, coming in at well over 630-odd pages. It has everything you need to play the game from beginning to end. It is a behemoth, a monster. Let's look at the table of contents so you can find what they have packed into every ounce, every corner of this book. You've got your introduction, ancestries and backgrounds. That's the first big change. We'll talk about that later. Classes, skills, feats, equipment, spells. And then you've got your setting guide. That's the Age of Lost Omens, which comes in 416 dang pages later. Then you've got playing the game, game mastering, crafting and treasure, list of conditions, your character sheet, and the glossary and index. Okay, let's do this. We've got a long way to go, so let's get through it. You can see here, the artwork is amazing. They've got that signature Pathfinder style, and if anything, they've sort of doubled down, and everything looks a little more Pathfinder-y, to the point where, like, I can pick out now if a piece of art feels more Pathfinder or more D&D, which is a pretty cool, like, visual distinction that these two games have going on, even though they kind of both came out of each other. Indeed, you can see a lot of D&D's influence on this as we go through the 2019 version of What is a Role-Playing Game. They give you your list of key terms and glossaries and an example of play. They are doing their best to make this game as newbie-friendly as they can, but as you can see, just from like the fact that we're 20 pages in and we're still kind of talking about things, this is a heady book. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's going to take a little bit of work. There's a lot to digest here. And that's because Pathfinder is all about complexity, where D&D 5th edition is a little more streamlined and, designed to get you playing the game and into the narrative. Pathfinder is designed to help you make your character. So, character creation is the biggest section in this book. It's more than half of it. I want to talk about that. So, let's start with the biggest change, which I actually love, and I think more role-playing games should do this. Instead of races, we have ancestries. That's just, hands down, race is a very outdated term to describe like a species or a creature. Ancestries is a great way to do it. You've got all the familiar ones: dwarf, elf, gnome, goblin, halfling, human. You might be wondering where some of your other favorites are. They kind of got folded in, so we'll kind of take a look at those in a minute. And then you have got your new classes. There are 12 all in all in the base book, but don't let that fool you. There's plenty more where that came from. But let's see. Here are the new ones for 2nd edition. You've got your Alchemist, your Barbarian, your Bard, your Champion, which is the Paladin, your Cleric, your Druid, your Fighter, your Monk, your Ranger, your Rogue, your Sorcerer, and your Wizard. Nothing super fancy. Nothing, like, out of nowhere, but each class has so much depth and crunch to it now. So let's, this is a laughably simple step about everything that you need to do, but let's get through that. So, as you make a game, you will do a few things. You will pick an ancestry, which determines what kind of creature you are. I want to show off, I mean, you see all of these, and you can see some of the stuff going here, but I want to show off how they changed humans, because I think it's pretty interesting. So humans also encompass half-elves and half-orcs now, and they all have, like, you get to pick what heritage you are when you're a human. Are you a human with half-elf heritage, half-orc heritage? Do you have skilled heritage, which makes you better suited to training in new skills? Or are you a versatile human who that's the bonus feat. That's the humans get a bonus feat. They've always gotten a bonus feat. Here it is. That is probably hands down the best one if you're not playing a half elf or half orc. I mean, skills are great and all, but everything in Pathfinder 2nd edition is all about feats, and nowhere is that more relevant than when you pick an ancestry, because you are not done when you decide, I want to play a human, I want to play a versatile human. Then you have to pick an ancestry feat. You get one at first level. There are 7 different ancestry feats to pick from. which go from things like adaptive cantrips, which lets you basically learn a cantrip from a magical tradition that isn't yours, pick up a different cantrip, or you could learn to use unconventional weaponry. There's all kinds of stuff. And then, as you see, when you hit 5th level, you get another one. When you hit 9th level, you get another one. Half-elves and half-orcs have their own Ancestry feats as well, as do all of the other Ancestries in this game. Then you pick a background, which comes with its own stuff. It trains you in skills. It gives you a special skill feat. And then you learn what languages you know. And then finally, you're ready to start picking your class. Now, again, there are 12 classes, but each of these classes has a lot of depth and complexity to it. We're going to show off the Alchemist. This is one of the new ones. It also happens to be first, so go Alchemists. They've got their new Goblin player ancestry here on display, and the Alchemist shows off pretty much everything that there is. So, in addition to the abilities provided by your class, you get your ancestry and background with all of these things. Now, you'll get Alchemy, which is a pretty broad chunk, but it's basically all your starting feats. This gives you the alchemical crafting feat. This gives you 4 common first-level alchemical formulas. You get a whole bunch of other stuff. You also learn to use infused reagents. You learn advanced alchemy as you go along, and you can do quick alchemy. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can basically learn as you go. You also get skill increases. Skills work a lot differently. We'll talk about those. You get ability boosts every 5 levels. That ups one of your scores by 1. If it's above 18 or at 18, or by 2 if it started out below 18. You also get a field discovery that kind of is your archetype. You could become like a bomber, chirurgeon, or a mutagenist, which basically kind of skews your character towards one of 3 different play styles: bombing, healing people, or creating weird mutants, which is kind of a buffing class. You have, as you'll see, a number of feats that you can pick. Every level you'll get, at certain levels, you'll get different Alchemist Feats. You have a list of different Alchemist Feats to choose from that take you from level 1 all the way through to level 20. Each of these are kind of skewed towards a different play style. They give you different abilities. These are basically how you get your class features, but instead of having a prescribed like archetype or subclass that tells you what features you basically get to create your own sort of under the purview of these 3 general skill types. Now we'll look at one more class. I'm going to show off the Champion because that's the other sort of newer one, although it is, again, pretty Paladin-y. If you are a champion, your strength comes from your devotion to a deity and your martial prowess. You have smite, you wield a deific weapon, you have a cause that you've sworn yourself to, but champion is not just for paladins. Paladins are sort of the lawful good version. You can also decide to be a redeemer and be neutral good, or a liberator and be chaotic good. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff you get. As you can see, you still get all of the, like, here's the first level feats and everything that I'll get. All of your class progression basically follows the same formula, except you have champion feats that you'll pick from, and then you'll get a different 5th level archetype as well. Again, it all makes sense, and it's all a little bit more simple than it feels, but it's still very there's a lot of crunch to it. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of freedom to define your character, but you'll have to do a ton of work to do it. Every class gets the same treatment. Every monk has their options, whether that's playing as a key monk or a crane monk and using grace and dexterity. There's a lot of different options, and you will have, let's say, let's show off how much you'll have to read through to show, just to pick your class. You'll start about here and go through to here. So that's a lot. That is a chunk of pages. There's a lot to digest. The classes include everything from the actual classes themselves to rules for using animal companions and familiars. They're all sort of active and a lot more combat focused by default. Badgers have Badger Rage, for instance. Bears have a Bear Hug. They all have different abilities that they'll use. Depending on what you pick, you get different sort of things you can do with them. You can also specialize your animal companions, giving them extra buffs that kind of gear them towards doing something like attacking enemies, being an extra, like an off tank, adding extra mobility. Then you've got different familiar options, which you can pick, and they can let you cast spells and do a few more things. And then finally, multi-classing is another thing worth talking about. So multi-classing is done a little bit differently. You pick an archetype, which means that you can select archetype feats instead of class feats. Now, what does that mean? That means basically this is how you're going to multi-class. So if you take an archetype feat, you're going to have to still like abide by all the prerequisites and everything. But if you have a class archetype, you can take a different multi-class kind of feat to start playing with them. So for instance, if you wanted to play a multi-class Alchemist character, you could take Alchemist Dedication, which would be your feat at 2nd level. That lets you, basically that's you put your alchemical interest into practice, you become trained in alchemical bombs and crafting. You gain the Alchemist's infused reagents and class features, gaining a number of reagents each day. So this, I guess this is the one you would take if you were like a fighter and you wanted to multi-class into Alchemist. Or if you were a, say you were a champion and you wanted to multi-class into being a bard, you would take Bardic Dedication. So that kind of gives you access to certain class features, and then you can pick from the Bardic archetype feats to kind of layer in different class features as you go. Again, it's all about the customization and the personalization of each class down to the very granular levels. Because, as you'll see, we aren't through creating our character yet. So let's say we've decided to play a human champion. We've picked our Ancestry feats, we've picked our 1st level feats, we've generated our languages, our background, we have our background feats and skill training proficiencies. Now we have to figure out what our modifiers are. So your skill modifier is a very simple formula made up of a lot of different parts. There's your proficiency in the skill, which can be trained, expert, master, or legend. Those are 4 different things that you can also be untrained, but that's not proficient with the skill. But these are things that you can do, and each skill has different skill actions that you can take, which again is cool. It shows you like, okay, this is how we want you to use these. Reading through this, it reminds me a lot of, if you ever played Anima, there's a lot of sort of that style fused in with some of the later developments of D&D and where Pathfinder was already heading. So it's a very very crunchy, kind of granular kind of system. So let's take a look at acrobatic action. So you could balance, which requires that you are in a square that contains a narrow surface, uneven ground, or other similar feature. You can attempt an acrobatics check against your balance DC. You are to go across it. If you get a critical success, you can move up to your speed. Just a regular success, you can move your speed, but it's difficult terrain. Failure, you don't move, and critical failure, you fall and your turn ends. So there's a lot. These are examples of some of the things you can attempt depending on how trained you are. So if you're untrained or trained, you might make it across a wooden beam or tangled roots or uneven cobblestones. If you are a legend at acrobatics, you could walk across a razor's edge or chunks of floor falling in midair. So you can kind of get a sense of what the power scale is. And every skill is like that now. Every skill is here to show you, like, okay, this is how you're going to interact with the world. Here are some sample things that you can do with it. Then we have all the general feats as well. Because of course we do, because it's Pathfinder. What would it do if we didn't? So you've got skill feats, which you can see there are a ton. You've got general feats that aren't tied to them. You've got crafting feats. You've got feats that require you to be trained in different feats. So like, let's say you are trained in Intimidation. You could take as one of your skill feats Intimidating Glare, which lets you demoralize with a mere glare. When you do, Demoralize uses the auditory trait. It gains the visual trait, which means they've got to see you, and you don't take a penalty if the creature doesn't understand your language. It gives you a little bit of extra breadth, but it's also very, very finicky. Like, stuff like that feels like there's such a thing as too much customization, you know? I don't know that I'd necessarily want to take that feat, you know? I mean, if you got it from background, and it's cool to say, yes, you're doing that, but also, you know, Intimidate could just have been a broader thing where you didn't have to share language. You could just shout or use threatening body language or anything like that. We'll move on to one of my favorites, Trick Magic Item, which is down here, which lets you basically, it's the old, like, use magic device. It tricks the magic item into thinking that you've got the prerequisites to do it. Then we've got equipment. So I want to show off some of the new weapon things as well. Every weapon has a ton of different qualities to it. Now, these weapon traits are what make the weapons different from one another. There is a very real difference, and a mechanically represented difference between a short sword and a long sword and a great sword in here. But there's also a big difference between a maul and a warhammer and a light hammer. And a great club, and a halberd, and a guisarme. There's just, there are a ton of weapons basically built in, and they all have their own special abilities and nonsense that they do. Some of it's great, some of it's a little bit confusing. Every weapon gets its own description, but you don't really care about what the description is. The only thing that really matters is what the weapon traits do, which, if you wanted to find that out, you'd have to go digging around for that. So let's talk about this list of weapon traits. So a few things are very familiar. Finesse, you use your dex instead of strength to determine attack rolls. You also use but you still use your strength when doing damage. If it's a forceful weapon, if you hit with it more than once on your turn, your second attack gains a circumstance bonus to damage equal to the number of weapon damage dice, and each subsequent attack gains a circumstance bonus to damage equal to double the number of weapon damage dice. So the more you hit with it, the more damage you do. Then you might also use something that is jousting, which means that if you move at least 10 feet while you're mounted, you get a circumstance bonus to damage for that attack. You've got non-lethal weapons, which do non-lethal attacks. You've got parry weapons that can be used defensively to block attacks. You can spend an interact action to position your weapon defensively, so that you can gain yourself a bonus to your AC. It's basically like, not exactly a minor action to defend yourself, but it gives you something that you can do instead of using an object during your turn, or opening a door or whatever. There are backswing weapons that increase your damage if you miss and then hit, or that make it easier to hit after you've missed. There are twin weapons that work as pairs. There are reach weapons. There are freehand weapons. There are a ton of different things. And you'll want to figure out what all of them mean, because you'll need to know that so that you can figure out how to make your character do the thing you want to do, which, if you're looking for that kind of puzzle, is great, but it also means there's that much more that you have to go through before you figure out, okay, I'm a rogue who fights with a rapier, and that means I can do all of this kind of stuff with it, but what if I wanted to be a rogue that fighted with a whip? What does that mean? There's a lot of, each choice matters more, but also every choice matters, and sometimes that feels like it can be a little overwhelming if you aren't used to it or if you're not looking for it. It's not necessarily bad, but it's something to keep in mind as you go through this. Then, of course, we get into the spell section. One of the biggest changes to Pathfinder is you've got your cantrips here, which are now basically, if you've played 5th edition D&D, you know what a cantrip is, and they're still the same thing. You're going to keep doing that. They have different categories of spells here. All the things you're used to: saving throws, counter spells, casting components, whether they're material, somatic, or verbal. That's all still there. You've got your cast time. There are several spells that take longer than one action to cast. There are several that you can cast as just an action. They all have these different descriptors to them. These are all like different triggers and stuff. Spells go up to at least level 10. Here's Cataclysm. You call upon the unimaginable power of world-ending cataclysms, ripping a small piece of each cataclysm and combining them together into a horrifically powerful attack. The following effects come down upon all creatures in the area. Treat the resistances of creatures in the area as if they were 10 lower for the purposes of determining the cataclysm's damage. Each creature attempts one basic reflex save that applies to all damage. It does acid, bludgeoning, cold, electricity, bludgeoning again, more bludgeoning, and fire damage to everyone. And it all kind of depends on where they are. Like, if you're flying, you might get hit with more things. If you're swimming, you might get hit with some other things. But basically, you're going to hurl a bucket of D10s at your foes. And it is a 1,000-foot area blast. Or a 60-foot area burst that you can cast from 1,000 feet away. And the spells are pretty cool. Some of these are uncommon spells. Some of these are attack spells. Some of these are transmogrifying spells. There's a lot to dig into even in picking your spell. You can see the spell section is going to take us all the way through to the second half of the book. That is going to take us... We're still there, folks. That is going to take us to the campaign setting. Now, there's a lot of stuff here as well. It's an introduction to Galarian, which is a very specific place. Every country, every city, all of that stuff has been explored in the 10 years that Pathfinder has been around. As we talk about the Age of Lost Omens, we're introduced to this new part of 2nd edition Pathfinder. A lot of what has happened in the ensuing time between the end of 1st edition and the beginning of 2nd edition has a lot to show you. You can read about all the different nations and cultures and ethnicities that are out there. You can learn a little bit about some of the creatures that define this era. It's a cool way to introduce a whole bunch of new lore and kind of bring everything that's been out there from a decade onto the same page. I really like it. You also learn about the gods, you learn about their domains, which is important if you're playing a cleric. Then we get into how you play the game. It's basically, if you've been playing a D20 system, you know the drill. You roll a D20, you figure out what bonuses and penalties you have, and then you roll and compare it to a DC. That's pretty much the core of any of these kind of games. A few things do come into play, which is like when you get to apply modifiers and when certain abilities or feats give you the option of doing something that you couldn't otherwise do. A few things also are different. Multiple attacks are still a thing you can do, but you have a penalty. The more attacks you make, the less accurate you become. If you're making multi-attacks with an agile weapon, you'll suffer less of a penalty, but you'll still suffer a penalty. You've got your range penalty to deal with. You're going to try and be hitting their armor class. Of course, you're making a weapon attack. That's just how it's going. And you have got a ton of stuff to get through. We'll talk about conditions as well. How you'll use different skills in the game. Not just using the abilities, but like how they apply and like what kind of actions you can take in combat, what kind of movement things you can take. There are a few things here, like these are your combat actions. So you can look at aiding a creature, interacting with an object, seeking, which is basically looking for things, sensing someone's motive. Those are all different actions that you can take. They're all kind of called out very clearly. This is a very, very crunchy, very tactical kind of game. So, as we get into the game mastering section, it kind of talks about the Pathfinder style and modes of play. It talks about encounters and skipping encounters. It has a great section on social encounters. It also talks about how to set up consequences for your players. And then, as we finally make our way through to the magic items section, you get all of the different items, which look very much like the spells, which look very much like the feats, which look very much like the equipment. Everything kind of has that same basic structure of give it some tags, how do you use it, what does it do? And it kind of brings everything onto one page, and it's very modular, and you can kind of plug and play different things. I think it would be easier for you to make new things in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, weirdly enough, despite all the different restrictions that are out there. But as you can see, this book has a lot of game to offer you. It knows that the players of Pathfinder have used their game for 10 years, and it isn't everything that was out there, but it is a lot to jump off with. This book is hefty. And now, of course, we've got the character sheet, which, as you can see, is very, very complex. There's 4 different pages of stuff, but it's all kind of necessary. So, that is Pathfinder. Is it good? If you're looking for a lot of crunch, it's great. If you want a very complex, modular, tactical game where you can build the kind of hero you want to build, this game is for you. It may be difficult to digest. I think there's a higher barrier to entry, especially for players that are new to RPGs. But if you're looking for like a more complex or a more robust version of character creation and character building than D&D, check out Pathfinder. That is 2nd edition. We're going to go through the bestiary as well, so be sure and keep an eye out for that. I'm JR. This has been the Bell of Lost Souls. Thanks for watching.
Click to subscribe. Check out more videos. And thanks for watching.